Hey, gang, welcome to the Happy Hour webcast. It's 5 o'clock Friday, and you know what that means. Time for another WhiskyCast live webcast. I'm Mark Gillespie, and good evening to you in the whiskycast.com studios in the charming yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. Hope you've had a fun week watching the ballots come in, and slowly but surely, I think there have been whiskeys that have been distilled and matured in less time than it's taken to get these election returns in, but not by our guests tonight. Before I bring in Matt Hofmann from Westland Distillery and Dr. Stephen Jones of the Washington State University Bread Lab, just some quick news that we got today. Whiskey Advocate has now had to officially cancel all three of the Whiskey Fest events that were set for a month from now. The week between December 4th and the 11th in San Francisco, New York, and Chicago, all because of COVID-19 requirements. And if you've been checking the calendar on our website, Germany was one of the few areas where live events had really started to return. Villa Canthor in Limburg, Germany, has now had to cancel all of its events through the end of November. They had a whole bunch of tastings, except for one virtual tasting that is taking place online this evening that they're doing. So treat everything as tentative. We've got events on the calendar well into 2021 and even one for 2022 so far. But if it's an in-person event, treat it as tentative until you hear otherwise, probably until just a few days or so before the actual event takes place. We're taking your comments and questions for our guests live in the chat forums on YouTube as well on Periscope and on our Facebook page. And we will run those up through the evening. And we will have a little bit of fun here. But let's bring in our guests right now. Matt Hofmann, the Master Distiller at Westland Distillery, and Steve Jones of the Bread Lab at Washington State University in the Skagit Valley. Hope you guys are doing well tonight. Let's find out, first of all, what you guys are drinking. Steve, I know you poured some tea earlier. You're still at the office, right?
Yeah, that's hot tea. Yeah.
I'm kind of in the same boat. I'm still drinking a bit of coffee. I've got some more work to do. I feel like if I begin having a dram at this point of this very long week, I won't want to keep working for the rest of the day. So still out here on the West Coast, still got some work to do.
Not a problem there. I mean, it's still the middle of the afternoon out there, but since it is 5 o'clock here, I am sipping some of one of the whiskeys from the new Westland Outpost range, the Caleri, and we're going to talk about this one extensively because it involves barley that you guys distilled that came from the Skagit Valley, that came from the Bread Lab. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Steve.
Yeah, it's a barley that was developed through Oregon State University first, and then we figured out that it grows well up here and then connected with Westland, and I think we'll probably give some more detail on that. But yeah, it came through here.
Let's explain what Alba Barley is, because we've heard of Golden Promise and a bunch of the other varieties that come out of Scotland, but this is a unique one, right?
Yeah, it's a 6-row winter feed barley. So it really illustrates what we all do out here. So what I should say too, Skagit Valley is north of Seattle. So it's cool and wet here, and barley likes that. Barley's a cool season grass. So we're not in the grain belt by any means, but it does well. So it's a 6-row winter feed barley, which all those things are kind of wrong if you're a maltster or using barley in any way. Feed, 6-row winter, it's all a little goofy. So it did well here for the farmers, and that's where we start. So if something does well for the farmers, then our model in the Bread Lab is to make it work for the rest of the stream, right? So in contrast to a commodity system where it has to be defined up front and then maybe it'll work for the farmers. This works for the farmers first. It yielded well, it stood up. The maltsters then figured out how to malt it, and it did well, and then Westland took it from there. But it's quite a unique style, and that, again, that's our model, whether it's colored barleys or 6-row, 2-row, winter, spring, doesn't matter. So
And Watchman 999 is going, bread? So let's explain what the Bread Lab is and the relationship to whiskey, because you're using barley, you're using wheat, and you're using a lot of grains that go into whiskey, and they have a lot of the same purposes, right?
Sure. So we called it the Bread Lab just because we thought it kind of sounded cool, maybe. So I don't know. But we're breeders that go beyond that. So we're plant breeders first. We work with wheat, barley, rye, buckwheat, dry beans, all different types of things. And we make those work for the farmer, like I said, and then we find the best uses for them. But barley is part of what we do. Our program has been at the university since 1894, so we have some longevity. And again, we're breeders that carry it a step further. So we make it work for the farmer, and then we go from there. But yeah, we're called the Bread Lab, but we do much more than bread. But we do a hell of a lot of bread too.
And let's talk about your background, because you were the official Washington State wheat breeder for a number of years, right?
Yeah, so I've been at WSU since 91. In 95, I was offered the job of winter wheat breeder for the state of Washington. We have 2.5 million acres here. My job was to make a bunch of white flour, make a bunch of wheat that turns into white flour. So I was on Pullman in the main campus, which is in eastern Washington. 11 years ago, I took my program and I left the whole commodity system, and I moved here north of Seattle to Skagit Valley to work on non-commodity uses for our grains. So we're a small, diverse area. The average farm size here is 100 acres, which is quite small by U.S. standards. The average farm in the U.S. is 1,000 acres. The average grain farm is many times that size. So we're small, we're diverse, and we grow non-commodity only. So we grow things that don't fit in a commodity system by choice. And what that means is then we can do interesting things with them by working with Westland and others. And we've worked with Westland since the very start. So,
and I'm not going to make a comparison between, let's say, commodity grains and commodity whiskeys, if you want to put it that way. But this would be the equivalent of, say, a craft grain in theory, which is sort of what Westland has been doing. Matt, tell me about Caleri, because this is a preview of what's coming out in the spring, right?
That is what you're drinking is what is coming out in the spring. In fact, it's all been bottled already. Caleri, so it's kind of beginning its trek around the world. We're releasing it around the world in the spring. So what Caleri is basically it is a part of this Outpost range, which is this exploration of new things in single malt. That's been our whole thing at Westland, Mark. Of course, you know since day one we've always been trying to do new things and to try to exhibit the terroir of the Pacific Northwest at the same time. We're not Scottish. And we respect that industry, but it's just a recognition that that's not who we are. We're way out here on the the Pacific Northwest, the coast of North America. So what we're trying to do here is fundamentally different from the get-go. And so what Caleri is as a bottling will be an annual edition style release where we are basically doing what we've been doing. People have been exploring Gariana with us over the past few years, exploring something new in barley all the time. And Caleri, the word Caleri is Latin. It means to cultivate. And we chose that name because what we're trying to do here is not just utilize new varietals of barley, and that's certainly true. I mean, the Alba varietal of barley is not used anywhere else in the whiskey industry, anywhere in the world, but it's also about re-examining fundamentally our relationship to barley and to agriculture. So as Steve said, this is the non-commodity side of what we're trying to do. Now, there's great whiskey being made all around the world, made with commodity barley, made with, in the UK, that's usually Concerto. And here in the US, that's Copeland, a lot of stuff we've been doing for Copeland. But, Mark, as you're kind of describing, it is like the equivalent of commodity whiskey versus, craft whiskey, even though that definition is a little bit confusing sometimes. But, if we're all using the same grain, in the Scottish whiskey industry, they're really all using the same exact varietal of barley, and there's maybe up to 5 that are in play at any one given time. And we have used more than 20 varietals of barley. And so these explorations of these new varietals are all going to be fed through the Caleri project.
And when maltsters are looking at various barley strains, Steve, you can explain this. There's actually a list they go off of that recommends these commodity strains of barley that farmers grow all over the northern half of the country, right?
So there's the AMBA, right, is the governing body, and it has to work in AMBA, or most farmers don't see it, or brewers or distillers. So we kind of go the opposite direction. So Fritz was a barley, spring wheat barley developed by WSU, not by us, but by other folks here. And AMBA said it was one of the worst barleys they've ever seen. And the irony, or the truth, is that the brewers say it's one of the best malts they've ever seen. So it just falls into that trap of commodity. Everything has to be the same, right? And then it becomes self-defining, right? That guess what? Everything is the same then, right? So there's an approved list, and we just, for us, we ignore that list.
But why do commodity barleys get on that list? Is it because of the yield? I know when you spoke during the World Whiskey Forum earlier this year that was held at Westland and up at the Bread Lab, you were saying that farmers actually get better yields out of some of these grains, right?
For sure. So back to the original model that we have is it works for the farmer first, then we figure out how to malt it, how to brew it, how to distill it, right? That's the opposite of a commodity system, where if you're growing in that approved list, then the farmers see it. Otherwise, they won't, or the brewers or the distillers. So, yes, it's very self-defining, and it has nothing to do with. It has to do with the time it takes to malt it, and then all the parameters that are looked at as a commercial malt, right? But craft malters, and I should say that Skagit Valley Malting is a 2-minute walk from where I am right now, is the largest craft malt house in the U.S. by 3 times. So they're the largest craft maltster in the U.S. by 3 times, and they're 2 minutes from here. So they could malt anything if it slows down, right? So they figure it out. They have drum machines that'll do everything in one machine, as opposed to having a push system or an assembly line of malting, right? Where it has to finish in 7 days or whatever that is, or it prevents the other stuff that's coming from getting started, right? So they can malt in 5 days or 25 days. It doesn't matter to them. I mean, it matters, of course, but they have that flexibility.
We have a question for you from Bob Winning over in the Netherlands. Does less alcohol yield equal more taste? And this, you guys can debate this one for a second, because I actually have pictures of Skagit Valley maltings, of those big single malting machines. So I'm going to try to pull one of those up here real quickly while you guys debate the less alcohol yield versus more taste.
I don't think we'll debate it. Or we may, I don't know, but there doesn't have to be a correlation between yield and taste. So the folklore is the real low yielding things. I'm talking yield in the field, not Matt can speak to the alcohol yield, but yield in the field, heritage, heirloom, or ancient, they're all so much better because they yield less and they're more. So we don't believe that. So we think you should get the most you can from an acre, yield-wise, in a responsible, in a meaningful way, and then turn it over to the maltsters and the distillers. But we don't see a correlation between yield and flavor agronomically at our end. So, Matt?
Yeah, certainly the yield in the field thing. So this is important for everybody to understand, is that yield, we look at it in these 2 metrics. One is yield in the field for the farmer, and the other is yield in the still house, which is the one that I think most people think about, but let's start with the former. So yield in the field is really important because, what AMBA is trying to do, which is the American Malted Barley Association, and I saw that somebody in the comments had pointed out there's similar systems in the UK and Ireland and other parts of Western Europe. That's absolutely true, is trying to make a one-size-fits-all barley varietal, right? So now that might be okay for Scotland or Ireland, perhaps, but America is a big country, so to try to fit one barley varietal that will work from Washington State all the way across to Wisconsin, which is kind of the traditional barley growing region, you end up with jack of all climates and master of none, so to speak. What we've seen out here is better than commodity yields, not with all of the varietals, but certainly that's the goal, is actually to beat. I think 3 tons to the acre would be seen as a great yield in the AMBA system, and we've seen some varietals that will yield upwards of 4 tons to the acre. And so that's really important to start there, because without that, using a new barley varietal isn't viable economically in the long term, right? We can try to do all sorts of parlor tricks, but if the farmer can't grow a barley varietal and make money doing so, it's a trick. It's a charity. So that's the first thing. The second thing is in the still house. Now, for people who have been watching Westland and following along with us for a long time, you know that we use some roasted malts and have since the beginning. Roasted malts, taking malted barley, roasting that to produce flavor. That roast flavor is coming at the expense of yield, because that's created via something called the Maillard reaction, which is amino acids and sugars coming together under heat to produce flavor. So that sugar is lost to yield. But the big thing that is really still underexplored, it's being more and more explored now today, is varietal flavor. Now, varietal flavor can come from a variety of sources. It can come from the amino acid structure within the grain. So the proteins that are within the grain, when they're broken down through the malting process, the proteins are broken down into their amino acid building blocks. We believe that one of the things that can be linked to varietal character, something we're exploring, is these different amino acid profiles, which go on to create higher alcohols and different ester compounds. Then there's also the lipids, and this is a really big one. The lipids, the oils in the grain. There's possible, source of differentiation between those things. And it's not so much about more flavor versus less flavor. It's just about difference. People don't really know what barley varietals can taste like because they've only tasted one. Again, in the entire Scottish whiskey industry, it's almost all of it's concerto these days. I saw some other people had referenced Golden Promise and maybe Maris Otter earlier, and those are true, and have been used before. But you might see different varietal characteristics that you wouldn't be able to otherwise even expect. So what we've seen actually is some varietals have underperformed in the still house relative to the commodity standard, but some have quite dramatically overperformed. And that was frankly not something that we were expecting. And I think it has less to do with, the starch content, but also just the type of barley that we use in our process. So the key thing here is that we don't need to choose one or the other. This is so important, and this is set up as this false decision that we in this industry need to make, is yield versus flavor. With the proper grain breeding techniques and using varietals that are chosen for location and matched to production process, you can really have it all, which is quite extraordinary. I would never have imagined that, frankly, 10 years ago when we were getting into this business, but it's true.
And you guys are doing a great job of killing time here while I do this.
I could keep going, Mark, if you want me to.
Because this really, I want you, while we're doing this, I'm going to pull up this one graphic, because this is, and I want you to, Steve, to explain what this is. This is your storehouse for what?
We call that our seed room. So that's right behind me. You can't see it, but it's a few walls down. There's 8,000 different types of grain in there. So it's wheat, barley, rye, and then buckwheat. On the left, you'll see some dry beans too. But that wall on the right is wheat, and the oldest wheat variety there is from the 1500s from the UK. The back wall are barleys that we use for malting, and this is how plant breeding works. So this is where our variation starts. We go into these lines, and we'll cross them into more modern types to bring the yield up, make it so it doesn't fall over. So barley is inherently weak in the field. I mean, it's a beautiful crop, but if you see it right before harvest, many times it's laying down. That's not good. The farmers get pissed when that happens. So you want to have it stand up. So we work on traits like that, but a room like that is, again, there's at least 8,000 different types of things in there. Each is in a jar. We've grown each of those in the field. It's a working library is another way to look at it. We'll go in and we'll find a name or a country or a year that we're looking for, and we'll just plant it out in the field. So it's quite a spiritual experience actually to be in there too. You can almost hear the voices from these varieties of 500 years ago. And if you have a variety that's 500 years old, what it means, and it gives a responsibility to someone like me, a plant breeder, what it means is for 500 years, each year for 500 years, somebody kept track of that and kept track of the name and what it was and kept its integrity in place over that time. So it's a responsibility. There's also a tremendous beauty to something like that. And we spend a lot of time there.
I'm surprised you don't keep it in cold storage. That's what surprised me when I looked in the room, was that it seems if you've got strains of barley that go back 500 years, you'd be keeping that stuff in cold storage, or would that kill it off?
Well, I'm in cold storage right now. I've got 4 layers on. So it's not like we're under a heat lamp here in Skagit. So that room stays about 60 degrees, which is okay. And then we replant things we replant everything within 5 years. Something in a jar on your shelf, a wheat or barley, will last 5 or 10 years easy. So it's not tremendously long term. For that, we'll go into freezers and things. So you're right.
Now we're showing the graphic. This is what I was spending the last couple of seconds doing. Photoshop on the fly, kids. It can be done. These are the big drum machines that are combined, steep. You can peat the malt in there. You can do a little of everything in these things. It's like a big drum, and that's a close-up of the window that you might be able to see in the bottom center of the big picture there to show what this malted barley looks like as it's going through there. As we were going through this and they were doing the demonstration, Matt, I know your colleagues that were in the room from Brook Lottie were going, we need one of those now.
Yeah, those machines are really extraordinary. For people who are not super familiar with the malting system, which I have to assume is most people, typically the malting system, you've got everything done in stages. So you've got to wash it, you've got to get all the bits of debris and everything off. You've got to then steep it, soaking up the water to trigger it to get out of dormancy. Then you've got the germination stage, which is the actual growing. Then you've got the drying stage, and then you kind of got the cleaning stage afterwards. It's really like 5 stages in one. So in most malt houses, what happens is those things are all happening in different physical places with techniques and equipment designed around a standard. And this is one of the things that Steve was talking about a little bit earlier, which is that's the system. That is what the commodity system says. Your barley varietal that is developed needs to be able to do all 5 of these things exactly the way our system tells you that it needs to happen, which is one of the reasons why so much of the barley that is used in this country and in Western Europe is very limited, just by that fact alone, let alone color, red, blue, purples, blacks, all these other things. But the beauty of what the Skagit Valley malting system does is that because it's all in one, there's no part of the system that's waiting on another part. So we can have stuff that goes in there. I know there's been stuff, we've used some varietals that malt. So typically malt is done in like 7 days or thereabouts. We've had some malts that have taken 9 to 10 days, start to finish, which in a traditional commodity malting system would be completely, it would be a non-starter. You would never, ever get that approved, and it wouldn't work functionally, because there'd be parts of the process that would be backing up behind it. So it doesn't work. I mean, the kind of, assembly line mentality, the Ford Model T, that's the way that the traditional malting industry works today. But the important thing about those machines that you saw, and I know it's kind of hard to tell because it's just big steel drums, at least that's what it looks like. But these guys who built it, they came from these extraordinary backgrounds. I mean, high-level engineers, multiple degrees in mathematics. One was the head of engineering for PACCAR. One was I was vice president of software design for Apple at one point. I mean, these are really, really sharp guys, and basically approached this system from the ground up to specifically work around the individual needs of a different type of malt, or a different type of barley, excuse me. And that approach is revolutionary, really, in the malting industry. So they were able to look at it and say, not what does the conventional barley system do? We said, okay, starting from scratch, what can we do to really celebrate the uniqueness of each barley variety? And they developed these machines to do it. And that has opened up, I mean, there's so many things that can be malted, it boggles the mind.
Truly. And
if I can interrupt quick, so there was a comment on they just need to have a peat machine, Matt, so you can comment on your peating, I think. I don't know if you're going to do that later or not.
That's what I was about to go to, because you can actually, they do peat in those drums.
It'll be 5 years in January that we have been making peated malt with Skagit Valley Malting. This is one of the big projects we started working on in the beginning. You know, back in 2012, we went up to the Skagit Valley, went up to Steve's conference at the Bread Lab, met the guys at Skagit Valley Malting. At that time, their machine was a little, 50-gallon drum in a garage. This is very typical, like West Coast entrepreneurial mentality here. They put all this stuff together, much like Westland, the way that we started our business. And we've grown up together. One of the big projects since the beginning was this peating project, because to the best of my knowledge, no malting company in the US had ever made peated malt commercially before. And we couldn't get peated malt. We wanted to do peated malt because we have quite a bit of peat here in Washington State. We wanted to do a peated malt made with Washington State peat. We found that peat bog back in 2011, but it took a long time working with Skagit Valley Malting to get that process right. It's still ongoing. The process tweaks here and there. We're constantly learning things, and we made the first batch, what I believe is the first batch ever of commercially produced peated malt in America in January of 2016. And so we've been making whiskey out of it now, and that's we've just announced this release that we're going to have out in a couple of years called Solum. Which will be made exclusively from this Washington State peated malt.
And just for our viewers, if you go to the videos section on the YouTube channel in our WhiskyCast channel, you can go back and actually watch the Westland video that we did several years ago out there with these guys, where we went out to the Olympic Peninsula and actually saw the peat bog that you guys work with for that. And once again, Solum will be out 2023, right? Is the estimate on that?
Yep, that's the target.
And obviously this is the Caleri that I'm drinking right now. You've bottled it already, but it'll be out in the spring of 2021. It will not be the April Fool's Westland whiskey, of course, right?
No. No, this is the real deal. In fact, we were planning on releasing it this year, to be totally honest. But this has been a tough year, not just in terms of COVID generally, but also what it's done for our partners in the industry. This has been really tough for our partners in the on-premise, the on-trade bars and restaurants. And it didn't really seem right to, bring this brand new whiskey to market, where there's still a lot of pain out there. So we're kind of hoping that by getting some time into the spring, things have begun to rebound a little bit. But we also want that to be a consistent springtime release. Every year, annually, that whiskey, will come up with a new edition, some new exploration, new varietal, and we'll launch that every spring everywhere around the world.
And Dave Kuhn says, isn't that peat bog an old military property? It was owned by the Navy, and let's just go ahead and tell the story there, because Dave's asking for it. For those who don't know about the peat bog you guys have access to. Yeah,
the story is, I've actually begun to hear conflicting accounts of this. So,
of course,
I'll try. Yeah, it's basically it was owned by the Navy and was kind of grandfathered into to be able to be harvested in peat. One of the big problems with peat is the harvesting of peat and the destruction of the habitat. What's called a cut and drain mentality. It's both bad for the ecology, for the ecosystem of that bog, but it's also bad from a carbon emissions standpoint, because when you drain a bog, you end up releasing basically the whole reason why peat is what it is because it hasn't decomposed over thousands of years. So when you drain the bog, it gets exposed to oxygen. Then all of a sudden, you've got 5,000 years worth of material decomposing all at once and releasing a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere and methane and stuff like that. So that's one of the things that most places around the world have said, okay, you have to limit peat harvest, and rightfully so with that. But the interesting thing about this peat bog is that it can't be drained, even if people wanted to. It is fed by like a natural spring, so it is constantly flooded. So all of the stuff that gets harvested there is not drained. This, which frankly, people think about cutting peat, and there's this romantic vision of what exists in people's heads. And I've actually participated in this myself. You go out to a bog in Scotland, you cut this beautiful brick, you sand it on the ground, and the wind's blowing in your, well, for me, my beard hair, but for everybody else, their normal hair, and it's just this really extraordinary experience. And they wait for these bricks to dry, and then they burn the peat. But we don't have that here, and so there's a lot of, again, this fresh approach, both from a lower environmental impact issue, which for peat I think is really, really important, to basically ensure that we're using the least amount of peat we can for flavor, and to not drain the bog, and to make sure the ecosystem of that bog stays alive. So that peat bog is, I think it's tied to that. It's one of the reasons it's grandfathered, and in addition to its old Navy status, is the fact that its harvesting is not destructive in the same way that traditional peat bogs have been.
And let's explain the status, because the Navy had it. They were harvesting peat to be used as, I believe, a fire suppressant or something on aircraft carriers through the Navy. Yeah. And it was deemed national security use when the Clean Water Act was passed in the early 70s, and that's why it was grandfathered in. Yeah, people don't quite understand, but peat is basically a sponge. When you take it and you dry it out, the reason that it is harvested, the bog, actually, where we harvest 2 cubic yards a year. It's nothing, very, very, for all of the peated malt that we create. Yeah. That's really it, Mark, is that much. Truck. But the majority of it is for spills and cleanups, especially fuel spills. So one of the more common things that happens is if you have a spill, and again, this is the way that the Navy would think about it when it comes to a fire, is if you've got a liquid fuel on the deck of an aircraft carrier or anywhere else, that fuel, if you don't get it up, is liable to catch fire. But peat can take that and absorb, I believe it's 900% of its weight back up in liquid. So that's still used today. And in fact, every once in a while you hear on the news about a tanker trailer turning over and spilling fuel on the highway or something. It happens, all over the world every once in a while. And what is fixing that, what's basically pulling all of that fuel or whatever it is that's would otherwise seep into the environment is peat. So that's one of the main things that it is used for, in addition to the conventional kind of potting soil type stuff. So that's really how it's still used today. The big difference between the U.S. and Scotland and Ireland is that peat has never been used as a fuel source here, as far as I'm aware. It's more just been for this the spill cleanup material. It's nature's kitty litter. It's you heard it here first, everybody. That's just. Yeah. Question for you, Steve, from Graham Fraser over in the UK. Do heritage barley types like beer barley that we hear about up in Orkney, do they grow in the U.S.? We have our own heritage strains of barley here that you're working with, right?
They do. So we've grown beer barley here. We grow it every year. We make crosses to it also to sort of modernize it. And I should say that we don't do GMO. We just use traditional breeding techniques. But that's a great example of a barley that has a beautiful tradition and heritage to it, and flavor and things as well. But it doesn't work so well for the grower here. It's a tough one to grow, and it's going to yield poorly. So we do grow it. We plant all these old ones every year and look at them, but we also try to do what people did when it was developed, is to make improvements on it. So that's what breeders do. So we don't just stay static. We keep moving forward, always with the idea of, can we do things? And I should say that our breeding program starting this year is 100% organic. So can we do it with as few inputs as possible, high as yield as possible, everything in the most responsible manners that we can do. But yes, we do grow that variety. Steve was just hitting on something that was really important. Sorry, Mark, if I can just, because there's something there that's really important. So we're not going backwards, we're going forwards. And even things, there's a variety that we have used and has been grown as part of our foray into more interesting barley varietals, called Obsidian. The story behind it is crazy. It's really cool, actually. It goes back to when back in the late 19th century,
some folks wanted to basically start the equivalent of FedEx or the Pony Express, in the desert states of North America, and said, okay, instead of ponies, let's use animals that are more likely to tolerate the desert climates. And so they said, okay, let's grab some camels. So they imported some camels from Egypt, and with it brought their favorite feed, which was this black barley varietal called Obsidian. And that project with the camels and the parcel service that failed spectacularly, I guess. The main complaint was that they smelled. But this story, I've heard it so many times, it's ridiculous. But this barley is stuck around in the Northwest, and it has this extraordinary flavor. I mean, it's like plum wine. The flavor was so striking, but it yields like a ton to the acre and can't be grown organically, like not even close. So that's the trap, I think, with heritage varieties, is that that's a 2,000-year-old variety from Egypt. We are, one, not Egypt, and two, not 2,000 years ago with evolving disease pressures and all that stuff. So, we're taking Dr. Jones and his team are taking these varietals and finding the good parts about them when it comes to flavor and crossing those against the things that are working well in terms of yield, in terms of disease resistance, and things like that. It's all about future facing, and non-GMO, all traditional, essentially rubbing barley, forgive me, Steve, but rubbing barley varietals together, and you create this new, offspring, this new crossing. And that's so different from, I think, how most people, including myself, traditionally view a heritage varietal. They think about going backwards, but in fact, we're taking the best of what was in the past and applying it to create something better for the future.
And what's important too, Matt, in that process is that's what was done, right? So we've grown barley on this planet in an organized manner for 10,000 years. So it's one of the oldest crops. So for every year over the past 10,000 years, the men and women that grow this crop would select the best or most unique or whatever. There was some value to it to them, and that's what they used as seed, right? That's been going on forever. So why would we stop it now, right? So we just keep moving forward in a real respectful way, right? Of respecting the beauty and tradition and the names, and we don't lose any of that. We just gain by using those and to develop newer varieties that will get as much as we can per acre. And in a changing climate and climate crisis, that's one good reason to do that, is get as much as we can per acre, and by adding diversity and things as well over time. So it's a whole big philosophy that for us works really well.
One of the things, well, if there's one thing I took away from the talk that you gave, Steve, at the forum back in February, color equals flavor. And we think of barley as this light tan, but the more color that's in the natural barley, the more flavor there is, right? And we breed that out normally.
For sure. So we work with blue, green, purple, black, tan. We work with all those colors, and Westland is working with us on that. They're funding a lot of this research. Is again in the commodity system. So if you look in wheat or barley, there's no button for purple, right? So you bring your semi full of barley to a grain elevator at a large malt house, there's no button for purple. There's no button for variable size. There's no button for purple, green, brown, and black all in one semi, right? We embrace that. We embrace that part of it, right? And what we know in wheat and with the malt, it's much more immediate to get the flavors out of beer, right? In brewing, distilling, that's coming, and there are flavors there ready to emerge. But for immediate determination, color equals flavor. There's no doubt. What's that color coming from, right? I mean, it's not just hanging around for nothing, right? So something caused that, and what caused that many times can also cause a nuance in flavor and things like that. So,
yeah, those color compounds, many of them are anthocyanins, and if anybody is a wine aficionado or a wine geek or wants to understand where varietal flavor comes from in wine, Anthocyanins are also in the skin of wine grapes and are responsible for the color, but also linked to varietal flavor. So this is one of the big obvious hypotheses, is that anthocyanin characteristic in different varietals of barley would have the same impact in terms of their link to varietal flavor.
Here's a great question that you guys can answer from Graham Fraser. He wants your views on the single terroir barley whiskeys from basically Waterford and Brookladdy, which, let's emphasize, is co-owned with Westland. But your view on terroir, and Steve, I want you to explain this in the category of, let's talk about the terroir within the Skagit Valley, because you've got farmers at both ends of the Skagit River, all the way down at Puget Sound, and then up in the mountains growing the same barley. And you see terroir from those different farms, right?
We do, and Matt can address that really well too, in terms of experiments that they're doing with, specifically with single varieties and terroir. What we know is, and it was unknown, certainly at least here in the grains, that there could be terroir in something as mundane as wheat or barley, right? And again, if you're in a commodity system, there's no terroir because it's been bred out or beat out of it, right? But what we know in wheat, let's say, is we have a flavor grassy, right? It's just kind of a hay flavor that's pleasant. The grassy that we have here is different than we would down in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. Okay, so that establishes terroir immediately, right? What we know that adds to terroir too, similar to grapes and some of the fruits, is that climate here we have a salty fog almost every morning. It's never been 100 degrees in this valley, right? As I said early on, barley loves cool and wet. What also loves cool and wet are fungi and bacteria. And fungi and bacteria add to these, add some of the terroir as well, we believe. So you have the soil component. We know that how is the soil treated? Have you beat the hell out of it, or is it growing and doing great on its own? And you have the soil, you have the variety itself, you have the environment, and then you have the year. So all those things can affect terroir immediately. And the reality is, it's an interaction of all those things. And again, just back to grapes and wine is a great way to look at that. But it's all those things and more, and more means things we don't understand. But Westland's doing specific experiments on that. So, and rotations too. So Matt, did you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the terroir thing is super interesting. I've been able to taste 4 of the new Waterfords actually that just came in, managed to procure some bottles recently. But of course, that our sister distillery Brookladdy has been doing that for a long time. And it's not just about the agricultural part, which Steve mentioned, which is absolutely true. But you can have all of the differences in terroir at the agricultural level. But if your malting system doesn't want those to be highlighted, they will go away. So literally not the whole point, but one of the major points of the conventional barley system is that they can take a variety grown in, let's say, Eastern Washington State and Montana and Wisconsin, which will have all sorts of different terroir impacts, and they take them, they blend them together to create one uniform product that is not expressive of terroir. That's like, as a major feature, if you will. And it is a feature actually of the commodity system. Like if your goal is absolute consistency at a national level, that's what the commodity system does. Is irons all that stuff out, literally blends it together to iron out those characteristics. But if you focus on taking those varietals, the varietal being grown in 2 different places and highlighting those and letting them be different and letting them malt in different ways, that is where you can have more exhibition of terroir. So this is where the malting component becomes really critical, is allowing, not trying to, if this thing grows over here and has X amount of protein content versus this one which has less protein, you can fidget with that stuff in malting to get them to be closer to each other, even without blending. But if you have a malting system like we have at Skagit Valley Malting, where you don't need to do that, you can in fact highlight those things. It's quite easy to capture terroir differences. And so we've been doing that. We've been exploring that. Functionally, we've done tests both between the Skagit Valley, the Willamette Valley down in Oregon, and then in the Palouse, with the same varietal being grown in the same year, and then being malted separately. So we've tested that. But even within the Skagit Valley starts kind of literally right on the coast, Puget Sound is the Pacific Ocean. And then it runs pretty deep inland, actually, kind of begins to go into the mountains a little bit. So we actually did a terroir trial last year of a varietal that was grown 30 miles up valley into the mountains versus one that was grown literally a literal stone's throw from the ocean. And that is going to, we think, make a big difference. And that's, it's still young whiskey yet, and it's still years to come. But all of that factors in together. And the one big thing that we haven't talked about, and really that is not talked about much in the whiskey industry at all, even frankly by Waterford and Bruichladdich, is the matching of terroir to varietal, right? We're talking about terroir in terms of, okay, there's a difference. Like you taste the Bruichladdich, the Alba Barleys versus Scottish barley, clear difference. Again, I've tasted the Waterfords, clear difference, but those are all with the same varietal of barley. But the beauty of terroir, I believe, in wine is that you have terroir and varietal matched perfectly together. This is where you get these, amazing, this is why Burgundy is special, right? This is why, all of these places, because they spent thousands of years putting these two things together. And that's a big part of the equation, frankly, that hasn't really been done before, but it's part of our goal here at Westland and with the help of the Bread Lab is to not just see that there are differences, but to find something that really works well in one terroir versus another, and perhaps say this terroir is ideal for this varietal, and this terroir, maybe just miles away, is ideal for this varietal.
And did you mention rotation, Matt? Your rotation studies too?
Oh yeah, so that's huge as well, because barley. First of all, I'll back up a little bit. I hope everybody is buckled in for an exciting barley conversation because I'm having a blast. So
we had a discussion back in, I think, late July on oak with one of the forestry scientists that had worked previously, Tom Kimmerer, that had worked at the University of Kentucky for a few years and is now doing private consulting. And it was one of our most popular shows ever. So our audience wants you to go deep on this. Let's get granular, so to speak.
Yeah. So the great thing about barley in terms of agriculture is not just what you can get, which is a yieldable product, but what it does for the rest of the farm, or the agricultural system that it's in, its role as a rotation crop. And a lot of people don't really know that because barley is not commonly thought of in this country. We mainly think of corn. Unfortunately, that's the big commodity grain, is the thing that dominates agriculture in the United States. But barley in particular has a really important role to play. So I mentioned earlier, we might get 3 tons to the acre of yield of barley when it comes off in a harvest. But barley puts, from everything that I've heard and understood, it puts about 8 tons of organic matter back into the soil, the root systems, the root structures, the straw. This stuff is basically helping to rebuild the soil after things that pull organic matter, that pull carbon out of the soil. Barley's putting it back in. So a lot of these places, including the Skagit Valley, they grow 80 different crops of commercial significance in the Skagit Valley. Barley, at the conventional commodity price for feed barley, is literally the 80th most valuable crop. It is the least valuable crop that all these people grow. But they need to grow it because of what it does for the soil. So these farmers who focus on specialization in really high-end crops like tulips, like heirloom potatoes, all sorts of things. I mean, again, 80 different crops of commercial significance. Barley plays this big role here and in other places around the world too. So one of the things that we've been testing is let's try out barley after something has been rotated before. So whether it's tulips, in fact, the first varietal, the first release of Caleri, Alba, that you're drinking there, Mark, that was rotated after potatoes. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at and marking, and this will for sure be part of the kind of exploration of Caleri as time goes on, is these rotation-based terroir impacts that we are studying. So maybe to add on to my earlier point about, soil, it's a general soil chemistry plus climate plus ideal varietal for that place, plus maybe even something ideally rotated before it. So maybe we'll get 50, this is going to take a long time, everybody, to figure this out, but maybe 50 years down the line, we're just going to have this, you can imagine, like this amazing barley varietal that grows in this part of the Skagit Valley that has these flavors. It yields really well, and after you rotate it after tulips, and the flavor is extraordinary. That's one of the things that is all possible when you begin to leave the commodity system and you just embrace what is barley's traditional role in agriculture.
Steve, how hard was it for you to convince farmers to get out of the commodity system, because they pretty much had a guaranteed market for their crop under the commodity system as long as they grew what the system wanted, right?
So they do, and what I convinced them here is we don't grow commodities, we grow food, and once they get that mindset, and then they're ready for it, because they grow such diverse crops. As Matt mentioned, we have 80 different crops here, so we're not like in the middle of Kansas, right? So they're used to diversity, but everything they grew, they would call it a commodity. And I said, you don't really understand what a commodity is. I was a wheat breeder for big wheat, and I do. And you're growing food, and you're price makers, not price takers. And that's a really important one. If you're a commodity grower, you're a price taker. Someone tells you, in this country, someone in Minneapolis or Kansas City or Portland, Oregon is going to tell you what your crop is worth, as opposed to working within a regional system and doing it. So it wasn't that difficult. And most growers here, certainly all the growers we work with here, within 5 years stopped using that word commodity, and they talked about food and the value of what they were producing. And they have that mindset, just what Matt said, is we have 12 families here that grow 500 million pounds of potatoes. Okay, 12 families. These aren't corporations. 12 families grow 500 million pounds of potatoes. They grow a hell of a lot of barley too, because potatoes beat up the soil. They used to grow barley, and sometimes they just mow it down, or wheat, and they didn't see any value in it. Now they see that crop, that food or spirits crop that they're growing, they see it come to the malt house here, or the mills here, or the bakery, or the brewery, or the distillery, and all those things here within the region. And it really gives them some pride, right? That they know what the end of that is that they're producing. So it wasn't that difficult. It would be more difficult in a true grain belt state, I would think.
I will tell you that just to emphasize the quality of the grain that's coming out, when we were there for the World Whiskey Forum at the lab, you guys were making pizzas with some of your local wheat and your local flour. Mm-hmm. And that was some of the best, and cooking them in the brick oven outside the bread lab. And I'm going, this is some of the best pizza I have ever had, because of those heirloom grains and the quality and the care that went into it.
Right. And they're not heirloom. I mean, they can be modern heirloom, but they're modern varieties that we develop. And that pizza crust too, Mark, what's important is that's 100% whole wheat. So, which normally you wouldn't be saying that whoa, that was the best pizza I ever had, and then find out it was whole wheat. So yeah, we really pride ourselves on that part of it. It goes with it. That's part of the terroir. That's part of the sort of respect for what we do and how it's grown and things. But it starts, I'm a breeder, and I can say it starts with the breeding, right? So
it's healthy too.
But it's also, if I can just kind of brag on the bread lab here for a second, is the other thing that's unique about the bread lab is that they are studying different use cases for these varietals that they are developing. So in the traditional commodity system, it's you grow this one type of wheat that can be grown everywhere around Western North America, basically, and it needs to make great Wonder Bread and have a great yield of white flour. But what they have in the bread lab, a little bit, over Steve's shoulder, is, different types of ovens. There's a reason why they've got the pizza oven there, because maybe they'll find a variety that's perfect for, whole wheat bread, a loaf of whole wheat bread, perhaps. Then there might be some other variety that is perfect for pizza dough, for pizza crust. And there's something else that could be, they've got a tandoor in there, to study things like making naan. So there's all these different cases there. So that's, the commodity mindset doesn't just stop with choosing these different varietals, whether in our case for barley for whiskey, or for bread, and for wheat for bread, but it's also the use cases. It's pairing. It's kind of like my terroir thing earlier. It's pairing ideal, in the case of bread, wheat varietal to the ideal use case for it. And that's something that's also dramatically different from the commodity system.
It's real important, Matt, and that's that model of there's not a bad wheat or barley. We just haven't found the right use for it yet. So it just opens up stuff just wide open. It's quite exciting.
We have this great question from Chris Ratcliffe for you, Steve. What does it make that makes corn and wheat so good for brewing and distilling? And why did people settle on those? Well, we know the Scots settled on barley for the most part, because that's what they had.
Throw certainly barley in there. There's some simple reasons. One is starch. These are grains. So the grains, we call them small seeded grains or small grains. Corn's a large grain. You could throw rice in there for Budweiser and things like that.
Why?
Yeah, sure. Let's not. Okay, so there's the starch is converted to sugars. The sugars are used by the yeast to make alcohol. So it's same like bread or beer or whiskey. You need starch, and that's what it's all about. If we could breed something that was just starch with basically no protein or anything else in there, it'd be great for certain uses. It wouldn't have flavor, but it'd be good for certain uses. So, yeah.
Yeah, for the most part, it's really, whiskey used to be connected to agriculture and to the grains that grew in specific places. In Scotland and Ireland, where whiskey was invented, that has always been barley. Over time, corn came into the game, but only for grain whiskey, really, and same thing for wheat to a smaller extent. In America, when people came across to North America, 2-3 centuries ago, they found out that the barley that they were using, Scottish and Irish expats, came across, settled in North America, found that barley didn't grow well. Rye did, though. The German immigrants had brought rye with them, and rye grew really well in the Northeast. So they started making whiskey out of that because that's what grew there. And then as they got kicked out of the Northeast down to modern-day Kentucky after the Whiskey Rebellion, they found that corn is what they had. They could turn that into whiskey. The problem is that idea has been kind of frozen in time. So the idea that American whiskey traditionally is viewed in this lens of basically corn, is just this relic of the fact that that's where the development stopped. And whiskey lost, in my opinion, it lost its connection to agriculture because they're importing corn from all over the place. Distilleries, many of the distilleries, the big, secret in Scotland is that only 2 distilleries that I'm aware of are using Scottish grown barley, at least 100%. Many distilleries are importing from continental Europe, and there's no problem with that. It's just that link between, agriculture and grain in the places where things have been distilled is no longer really necessary because you can travel, the grain can travel great distances. But there's an opportunity for us all to reconnect back to agriculture. For here in the Pacific Northwest, this is where barley thrives. In fact, barley, I think, grows better here than it does in Scotland due to our Mediterranean dry summer climate, which is ideal for the barley getting ready to harvest. But there's also, you look at other distillers, if I can talk about other distillers for a second, Highwire Distilling down in Charleston, all the way on the other side of the country, they're doing pretty much exactly the same thing as us, but with corn, because corn is the thing that grows really well down there, going back to corn varieties that work really well in Charleston and that region. And there's people in Pennsylvania doing the same thing, I think at Wiggle Whiskey and a couple others with rye. There's these things that are being reestablished. And so what I hope you'd see in the future is that what makes a varietal, what makes a specific type of grain good for whiskey, to the question is what matches to that distillery's focus. Is there a focus on making something of regional style, regional intent, terroir, and then you'll find the best version of corn, maybe in the Southeast, rye in the Northeast, barley in the West, will make these regional styles of whiskey.
And we have this question from Graham Fraser about Balcones Blue, which is made with blue corn. Do corn varietals change over time just like barley? I would assume they do, but corn tends to be genetically modified all the time because of the demand for it. So you don't get as many organic, non-GMO corn varietals, right?
They're more rare, but corn is designed to change over time. So if you get rid of the hybrids and sort of the GMO stuff, corn is designed to change. It's an outcrosser, all that pollen coming off the top, if you think of what a corn plant looks like. barley and wheat, you need variation in there, but it's not going to cross much. And then there was a question too on what is Budweiser. Budweiser is a big commercial beer in the U.S. And then
they're being sarcastic, Steve. That was sarcasm.
If there's one, if I can interject too, Mark, there's been a few questions on scale. The work that we do is scale independent. So Westland is not a small distiller, I wouldn't say. I mean, small on the gargantuan scale, yes. But the work we do is scale independent. So we work with Ma and Pa in the corner, and we go up and up. So scale has benefits, right? Scale can offer change. We don't attempt to change the commodity system. We attempt to kind of go around it or parallel to it. But scale is a concept that we're very interested in, just as a concept. It's fascinating for us. So scale is not bad or good. So,
Steve, I should have warned you. We have a couple of folks on the who are regulars here who tend to be somewhat sarcastic. The comment about Budweiser was good. There was sort of an inside joke around here. I should have warned you about that.
Okay, yeah.
And Spirit Bomb Tabitha in the UK was asking that she's heard that oats are really awkward to ferment. I know rye is a pain in the neck to distill, and Matt, maybe you can talk about this. I know your studies at Harriet Watt, you played around with oats a little bit, right?
Yeah, oats are really interesting because there's also a historical link. Oats, especially in Ireland and in Scotland to some degree, oats, really thrive in really wet agricultural systems. So I have not seen a ton of use in whiskey except for what was done by High West, where they made their silver whiskey out of oats. And I actually thought that was extraordinary. Silver whiskey is not really a thing that's taken off, but just the liquid that they made out of that was just the mouthfeel and the creaminess of it was really, really amazing. But yeah, it is notoriously difficult, worse than rye. Rye is really sticky to use, high beta glucan content. Oats, I don't have a ton of experience with it, but oats definitely, like, their whole thing is very, very difficult to mash with, to cook right, and then to clean. It just sticks to everything.
And I know Koval in Chicago has done some stuff with oats as well. And I think a few other folks have done, and Dave Q points out, Koval makes an interesting oat whiskey. Sergio Florides, it never rains in sunny Ireland. Sergio, we know you're being sarcastic about that. Let's talk about, because I should note that I have switched over now to the 5th edition of Garyana from Westland. And let's talk about Gary Oak for a second, Matt. Explain what you did with this year's batch of Garyana.
Yeah,
because you change this from year to year.
We do. It's always an exploration, like I was talking about with Caleri. That's always going to be an exploration. This is part of this Outpost range, this collection of 3 whiskeys, of which Garyana is really the leading whiskey of these 3. Is the idea is that we're exploring something new with it. And if everybody who's listening, if you're not familiar with Garyana, the whiskey industry, as I think we all know, talks always about casks, right? Maturation, the impact of maturation. There's not a lot of conversations about the oak itself, generally speaking. And so that's one of the things that we began to study early on, and we use a really high quality grade of Quercus alba, the American white oak, and all of our other expressions, all slow grown and air dried oak that's more typically used for wine casks. But the other thing we did right away, back in 2010 into 2011, we filled our first casks of this stuff, was we said, okay, do we have Quercus alba, the American white oak? Does that grow here? The answer was no, it doesn't. Quercus alba grows in the eastern half of the country, from Missouri all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, to the Canadian border, and down to the Gulf. But here we do have a species of white oak that only grows, and if you're not super familiar with the geography of the Pacific Northwest, which I would imagine most people are not, we are obviously right up against the Pacific Ocean, but we also have quite a bit of mountains in this region. And really, you've got throughout the Northwest, from kind of British Columbia down through Washington State, where we are here, in Oregon, and into Northern California, is you've got kind of these mountain ranges on the coasts, and you've got the mountain ranges that are kind of bisecting the Pacific Northwest, called the Cascades. And between those 2 mountain ranges, it's about 50 miles wide. Between those 2 mountain ranges is where this species of white oak grows. It's the only place that it grows. This kind of 500-mile long, north to south, from basically Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada, down through Seattle, where we are here, Portland, Oregon, and just kind of south, almost to San Francisco. It's the only place that it grows. And this species of oak is called Quercus garryana. It's the only native oak species that grows here, and it's like totally different from Quercus alba. In fact, it was the late Dr. Jim Swan, who was known as being the expert in oak quality, who wrote the first white paper on Gary oak, and so the oak chemistry is totally different compared to Quercus alba. It is closer to French oak in its phenolic nature, but just ultimately it's a huge departure. So we started using these some wood that we built into these casks back in 2011, and we back in those days, especially, you're making whiskey and you want to taste it like 3 months later. Usually that doesn't make a big difference. You're just overeager as a distiller. We tasted that stuff 3 months in, and I will never forget this day. And people who think this is hyperbole, it's not. It was like Kansas City style barbecue sauce, like drinking a whiskey made out of Kansas. It was just the wildest thing. And we said, oh, this is extraordinary. Not only is this oak, from around here, but this flavor profile is so distinct. So we like to think of, Quercus alba, the American white oak, gives you caramel, vanilla, coconut, baking spices. And Quercus garryana is basically all of that, but darker. Molasses, dark clove. It turns all of our normal fruity notes into dark kind of blackberry jam, blueberry syrup. And it has this savory barbecue, like burnt ends, if there's any barbecue fans on here, burnt ends, which is just extraordinary, has that savory element to it. So the thing is that this oak species, we weren't the first distillery to use it, but I do believe we were the first distillery to release something 100% matured in Gary oak. And we've certainly been the one that's kind of been exploring it as we've gone along. And that's the whole project of Garryana, is we're making single malt whiskey and we're behaving exactly the same way as our comrades in Scotland, right? 100% malted barley, water, yeast, oak, peat, if you want to think of that as an ingredient. But here we have this is the 5th species of white oak used in the whiskey industry. We've got the Quercus alba in the US, 2 oaks in Europe, Quercus robur and Quercus petrea. You've also got the Mizunara oak in Japan. I'm sure a lot of whiskey fans are familiar with that now. And this is oak species number 5. And because it's really never been explored before, that's what we want to do with Garryana. Like what we're doing with Caleri with these new varieties of barley, Garryana has been this exploration of what the Gary oak does with other parts of our house style. Because it's not just the varietal flavor, if you will, of the oak. It's also how these flavor compounds spend years coming together and creating something that is greater than the sum of its parts. So this edition 5, is launching actually here in Seattle tomorrow at the distillery, and it's launching around the rest of the world later this month here in November.
Gee, I guess we couldn't have timed this any better, could we?
It is quite perfect. So it's on its
Wasn't
way
intentional.
out. But yeah, so Garryana, the 5th edition is an exploration of the phenolic nature of Gary oak. So the spiciness that I'm talking about, these dark notes, the thing that's providing these flavor notes is phenols. Now, everybody who's listening, we're talking about peat earlier. When you think of phenols, you typically think of peat smoke, and rightfully so, because that's what's responsible for the flavor note in peat. So we had said, okay, we've got this cask where its characteristics as a tree species, as a varietal, is about phenolics. It is about that spicy, smoky character. Spiciness is also phenolic in addition to smoke. So let's do this. Let's explore heavily peated malt. Let's take heavily peated malt. This is not the local peated malt, actually, just to be clear with everybody. Let's take the heavily peated malt, Baird's from Scotland, 55 part per million phenolic content, mash that, distill that, put that into brand new Gary oak casks, and let that mature. Now, the thing with Gary oak is that it is wild, and it's full, it's full throttle. So one of the things that we, part of our house style at Westland that's been really important is this idea of balance. I believe so strongly that the best whiskeys are balanced, even in a whiskey like Garryana, which is focused, of course, on the Gary oak flavor. If that's all that you taste, if you go in there at 100% full throttle, you actually get less complexity, which is a big part of what we're trying to do in balance. We still want to be able to taste the other components of the whiskey. So Garryana Edition 5, it's about 36%, I believe, Gary oak, heavily peat and Gary oak. The remainder is just pale malt, so non-roasted, traditional commodity varietal in bourbon casks, maturing, which will give you kind of a nice. They're kind of like it adds space if you kind of think about whiskey dimensionally. I don't know if that makes any sense to anybody, but if you add some space in between these really impactful flavor notes from Gary oak and peat, it actually helps you see the complexity a lot more. And so with this 5th edition, it's just these, it's phenol on phenol, and it's just this extraordinary flavor because people who know peated whiskey will be able to pick out the peated phenolic notes right away, Marcus. I'm sure you're tasting right now. You pick up the traditional medicinal iodine notes, so that's in there. You know that it's peated, but at the same time, when you taste it, there's also this mesquite, barbecue sauce note in there, which is the calling card of Gary oak.
It's almost tangy.
Absolutely, yeah. You taste that and you go, okay, here's this from peat and here's this from Gary oak. But the beauty of the fact that these spent, it was 4 years in Gary oak, the peat and Gary oak there together, mixed. The other spirit was 6 years old in the blend, but the peat and Gary oak spent 4 years, phenolics and phenolics all together, and you have this spectrum now of phenolic flavor in this 5th edition of Garyana, where I can pick out the ends of the spectrum. I can pick out this is definitely peat and this is definitely Gary oak. But there's all of this stuff in the middle where I don't know. We don't know like which part is from where, or maybe it's again these are kind of greater than the sum of its parts, and we're seeing something really new.
Well, my only complaint is that when you guys screw with it each year and come up with a different recipe, I can't compare them from year to year to see how the whiskey's tasting as it gets older. When you guys change the barrel mix around, I can't compare batch 4, edition 4 to edition 5 to edition 3 because it's 3 completely different whiskeys.
Yeah,
and
that's
all I'm asking for is some consistency, for crying out loud.
So one of the things that we believe,
I kid, of course.
I know, but actually one of the things I think this is important is that we are not, we're not a laboratory. We're a whiskey distillery, and our goal is to make amazing whiskeys. And there's a perspective, I think, in the whiskey industry, especially people who are pushing new ideas, where it's like, and you see this actually a lot in the terroir game. I want to taste this terroir versus this terroir. Like, that can be interesting, but ultimately, are you making something that is really, really good? You can have the best ideas about terroir and new varietal flavor and all that stuff in the world. We are here to make good whiskey first and foremost. So exploring that stuff, we've changed things year in and year out and trying to push the boundaries. But every year we do that by not trying to stick to a similar formula. We're learning stuff, and that's kind of what Westland is really all about. Is we don't have history and tradition to fall back on. We have all of these things: the local peat, the species of oak that only grows here, these varieties of barley that we're only able to utilize because of our friends at the Bread Lab and Skagit Valley Malting and the farmers here. And it would be boring to just kind of make the same thing over and over again. And so we want to push it all the time. That's what Westland's about.
And we have a comment from Scott Blackwell, who is one of the founders of High Wire Distilling with his wife, Ann Marshall. Scott's watching. He agrees on the High West Oat, Matt. And we also had a question from, I'm trying to think, I think it was Gordon Fraser, who asked whether you'd ever try spelt, Matt, in your distilling. And you guys focus on American single malts. So I'm going to answer that one and just say no, because it wouldn't be an American single malt, right?
That's absolutely correct. We've decided to dedicate our attention to American single malt, and that being evocative of the Pacific Northwest. Any innovation that we do, with the exception of the occasional, like, okay, that would be kind of fun, and we'll break our rule just once. Most of the innovation that we do is all about further expressing American single malt through the Pacific Northwest. Now, there's other things that grow really well here. I mean, Steve's talked about wheat a lot, and that grows really well and is used for bread. Not as much used for whiskey. There's all sorts of things that also thrive here outside of the whiskey space, apples and other fruits and stuff like that this place can do. But we've decided to just make it simple and just focus on what is the world's oldest style of whiskey, single malt.
And Tyrone Cote is challenging his fellow Canadian. Have you tried the Garyana? I'm hoping you have, Connect, and I know Tyrone has, because I know you Matt, you did a tasting for the folks in Nova Scotia, the ARS folks, the Halifax Regional Scotch enthusiasts earlier this year.
Those guys were great. If there's anybody from there listening on, hello again.
Yeah, that's Tyrone and his folks. And Sergios in Ireland asks, is Gary oak more porous than white oak?
Great question. I don't necessarily really know the answer to that yet. I know that it doesn't have the same porosity issues that, say, Mizunara oak has, or Mizunara oak leaks. I think it is once the cask is built, it is pretty air and water tight to the same degree that it is a white oak, Quercus Gariana, but the same, as Quercus Alba also being a white oak. So it's the same porosity. The challenge with it is more in its brittleness. It is a more brittle type of oak. So you need to be very, very careful when it comes to shaping oak. And also it tends to twist and knuckle. I think a lot of oak, generally speaking, loves to shoot off these big branches, and it twists and does all these crazy, beautiful things when you see them out in the field. But all of that is actually makes it very difficult to build a barrel out of. So, that's, again, part of the thing that we learn and explore, going on is how to work with the species of oak at the same time. Because it's not, there's no traditional cooperage industry out here either. All that stuff is being built from the ground up at the same time.
I'm surprised there's no cooperages out there with all the wineries.
So there is more in Napa. So now we're working with a cooperage down in Napa. So that, which is, of course, just about the southern tip of Gariana's growth range. So they're working with it. And it's funny talking to them because most of their work is, of course, wine casks for the American wine industry. And there's like two guys who are basically running the place on the floor who are, spent 30 years here, but ex-Scottish coopers, and then came over to the U.S. and became coopers over here. And I think we were talking to them recently. We were talking to the plant manager, and the first time they were making whiskey out of this stuff, and they were charring the barrel, and they said, "Boy, this stuff smells weird." And there you can just imagine these guys have been working with Quercus Alba and Quercus Robur for their entire lives, and this stuff is totally different. So I would love to see more cooperages popping up here. I know there's a couple in Oregon as well that we also work with. We're not just exclusively getting it from California now. We have got a couple of partners. There's not one in Washington State, but I'd love to see that at some point, just being a Washington State native.
And since we've been talking, our folks have been talking about barbecues online. Spirit Bomb, Tabitha, I'm jealous of U.S. barbecues. They look so good. We do have the best fish and chips, though. Bill Ricker, we've got good fish and chips within driving distance, both Ottawa and the UK Pavilion at Walt Disney World in Orlando. That's a long distance away, Ricker, and I know you're based in Boston, so give me a break. Graham Fraser wants to know, what's the best introductory Westland whiskey? I'd say it's whatever one you can find.
Yeah, we make all of our whiskeys to be, as I said, balanced. We want people to be able to come into it and be approachable. They're complex and they've been fairly well received. I'd like to say that at this point. But it's something that we don't want our whiskeys to be esoteric. That's something that I believe super strongly in, is that, I want whiskey to be enjoyed by as many people as possible. And you can be complex without being intimidating or overbearing. So, for a lot of people, if you want to really get an introductory lesson into like what Westland has been about since the beginning, our American oak expression is a good example of that, because that's literally cask number one. The first cask of whiskey that we made, almost 10 years ago, was made with roasted malts, which, with the exception of Glenmorangie, Signet, now a couple of other distilleries, is not really done at all in the Scottish whiskey industry. Made with a Belgian farmhouse ale yeast, a Saison brewer's yeast, was definitely not done by anybody in the whiskey industry, and using new American oak, which is almost never done in Scotland. And so that foundation of just saying, okay, brewing influence, American whiskey influence with the new American oak, that was where we said, let's make something that is an American single malt from the Pacific Northwest, the brewing influence being that huge part of it. So that's where we started. Philosophically, that's where we started, to immediately try to make something that was not a copy of Scottish whiskey. And to be very clear, I don't mean that in a negative way against Scottish whiskey at all. I just mean, it's more, we have to create our own path here. I believe that super strongly, that there's cuisine to be had. This is one of the things that we in America haven't really done, frankly, is create true cuisine, food and beverage linked to the place where our agriculture comes from. And that's what we started from the beginning. So American oak is a great expression of that. You should be able to hop into anything that we release. I think if you're on this chat, if you're listening to this right now, I'm sure you could jump into any Westland and have a great time.
Except for this one.
Which one is that here?
This is the one remaining bottle of my blend from our press trip out there a couple of years ago.
Yeah,
I still have this one left because this is the one that you guys put together for me after our blending exercise during that press trip a few years ago. This is my blend of 3-year-old Westland from 2015. I poured this at the New Brunswick Spirits Festival a couple of years ago. The other bottle, I took it up there for some folks. So I think Tyrone may have had it. But
I was going to say, you got all of your regular fans here in the comments that...
this is mine. So I'm having some fun with this one. Good. Steve, I want to bring you back into this because we've sort of left you sitting here for a little bit. Let's talk about where barley cultivation is going in the near future. Can we get past the commodity system and bring in more small farmers into the business, or is commodity farming always going to dominate just because of the economies of scale?
Right. And before, I think it's a really good one, Mark. Before I do that, there was a comment on, can you distill quinoa, buckwheat, or millet? Quinoa I have not seen. It's kind of goofy with the gel that forms on it, but the maltsters here definitely do millet and buckwheat. It goes to beer as far as I know, but they bring millet all the way to roasting it after it's malted. So to your point, Mark, the United States started keeping track of barley acreage in 1866. There are fewer acres grown today of barley in the U.S. than at any time since 1866. Barley is a dead crop, basically. And I think it's dead for a few reasons. One is its price is based on corn, and corn is sort of the big evil empire in our country right now. There's 110 million acres of it. There's about 1 million of barley. So the price is driven by feed, and it's down in the basement. So that's part of it. The way I think to resurrect barley is to bring it back to how it was originally in this country and around the world, is smallholder farms and growing diverse versions of it and things like that. Give it some value in the marketplace, and that's outside of a commodity system. So yes, it's going down or flat. It can go up if we bring nuance and novelty to it, I believe.
And with the demand for American single malt whiskeys, as well as beers that need that flavor touch that barley provides, are we at the point of a barley crash in the U.S.?
A barley crash in terms of not having
terms of not enough production to meet demand.
That's true. We are in that. I can tell you that we are in a barley deficit in this country and have been for some time. I remember going back to a malting conference back in 2012. Actually, I think it was from AMBA. It was the traditional malting industry. And even back then, it was, at that time, we were growing less barley in this country than we are consuming. We're bringing it in from Canada, from Alberta and BC. We're bringing it in from Europe as well. So that's true. And even they showed this. I'll never forget this presentation where, barley has traditionally been, this northwestern part of the country, kind of Colorado to the northwest, and kind of, as I said before, including the Dakotas and maybe all the way to Wisconsin. And then they showed this graph of like the last 30 years, 10 years at a time, barley versus corn, and just barley shrinking, corn chasing, barley shrinking, corn chasing. The Northwest is kind of barley's last stand. It's this up here, this region where corn, still trying to push up against, it's the GMO corn, which is growing now in places that it couldn't grow in before. But it's hard for a farmer to be very fair. If you're a farmer and you're saying, I can grow corn and get a guaranteed price on this because of government subsidies, barley doesn't get government subsidies. Everybody forgets that, bourbon is all, frankly, subsidized by the federal government because of corn subsidies. Barley doesn't have that. So one of the things there besides that, which is a bigger issue that we're not going to tackle today, but this is where you add value to the barley itself. And this is where to get away from the commodity system, not to replace it, but to create something alternative to it, to create a way for farmers to grow barley and make more money on it. We pay double or triple the commodity price of barley, which is, that sounds nuts to a lot of people in the whiskey industry, but we're getting something for it, and that's the real challenge here. Is if you were trying to say, let's just use a local version of the commodity varietal, but it's going to cost twice as much. Will that really be worth it? And I think the answer honestly is no. It'd be very hard to make that argument. So a big part of what we can do here, but also what could be done in other parts of the US where there are also small pockets of agriculture going on at a very high level, which I include, the folks Highwire watching here, what they're doing in the Southeast with corn, what's going on in upstate New York as well. Those places won't compete with the commodity systems as you just go for the best. You're never going to compete on price, but you just go for the best. And that's where you need, your grain breeders and your maltsters and your farmers to all be on board with that and create a system that is adjacent to the commodity system.
Do we need federal price supports for barley just to meet the demand, though?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I would say in general, without getting into politics here, in general, I feel like we shouldn't do that. You should not need to rely on the federal government to make agriculture viable. That's kind of, and it.
But the federal government has been screwing up agriculture for 100 years.
Yeah, that's true. But that's the thing, is it's ended up screwing up agriculture. This is where corn has become this dominant monocrop thing in agriculture, and it's taken away from diversity, biodiversity, diversity of flavors, all these other things, and that's, if it's not viable in the free market, then, that's, it's you're not going to get innovation there either. So yeah, I think it's more that you'd want a level playing field for all grains, but, when it comes back to it, you would hope that, people who are drinking whiskeys or drinking beers or eating bread, really value the things that it's made from. And that's part of the larger movement, of course, that's happening in this country.
But we're screwed in this country then, because look at what sells. Budweiser, Coors Light, and all that crap.
I think we have reason to be hopeful, Mark. There is a lot of crap commodity stuff that's grown in this country, but it's, it serves a role. It has its place, but there is absolutely room for something that doesn't compete. How else would the craft beer revolution even exist? None of them compete on price with Budweiser, and yet they still exist. The same is true for, organic, vegetables and, all this other stuff. There's absolutely room for that to exist, and it's growing all the time.
They can't compete on price, but they can compete on flavor, for crying out loud. Sergio's Floridas.
Over time, one more thing is that you can probably, and I'm sure Steve could speak to this a little bit, is that over time, the idea is you want to be able to, you don't want to be completely independent of pricing either. That's one of the things that, I think they look at, especially in bread, where it's just, wheat and it goes to the miller. You can get closer to competitive pricing by utilizing, in the case of the Skagit Valley, a variety of wheat that really thrives in this region, and maybe gets bigger yields in the field than you would otherwise. And all of a sudden you can produce something that is maybe not the totally lowest cost option, but also not, as I'm sure Dr. Jones would say, it's not totally designed for hipsters either. It's not, one of the things that I think is really extraordinary about the Bread Lab is they've got this project called the Approachable Loaf, right, Steve? Do you want to speak to that? I might as well just let you know.
So a mature system is an affordable one, right? So how do we do that? It gets back to scale and things like that. And then the breeder's job, again, is to, we have heirloom wheats that'll yield 1,000 pounds per acre. We have our wheats that'll go 10,000 pounds, right? We have barley that'll go 1,000 pounds. We have barley that'll go 4 tons. So the key is bring yield up, bring the price point down, bring diversity into a system. That's a mature system, and then it'll all work, right? We don't need the federal government to tell us how to do that or try to help us to do that. So that's that one, right? There's a question from Sergio's on the on GM barley and grains. There are no commercial GM barleys in the U.S. or wheat, so there may be experimental lines that people are working on. We do not, but it's not commercially grown here. And a hybrid is not a GM, so there's a little purposeful confusion on what GM or GMO is. GM or GMO is crossing a barley plant with a jellyfish. You can't do that naturally, right? So it's just a good way to look at it, right?
There's not a market for it's not economically viable to spend the money to create genetically modified barley when the amount of barley that's being grown is just dropping year to year, right?
Oh, for sure, yeah, and it's about the control of the seed and things like that. So GM and GMOs is basically to control the seed, right? So, yeah, barley's irrelevant in most of those discussions, and it's farmer saved and things like that. So.
And our pal Louise McGuane at Chapelgate, who was there for the World Whiskey Forum, says, "Brilliant, guys." And with that, let's close it off. Any final thoughts from either of you?
I'll just go quick. Thank you for having us. It was a great discussion. It was really fun, Mark, and it was good seeing you again. And all the chat and questions were wonderful. I think for us as breeders that brew and distill and bake and do those things, we really look for the beauty in what we do. And there is tremendous beauty in a crop like barley. If you go to our website or Instagram, you'll see that, or on Westlands as well. But I think it's important, certainly now more than ever, just to capture the beauty of what we do and what all of you do also. So thank you.
And I had wanted to do this before the pandemic hit, but if it doesn't happen this spring or summertime next year, I want to get out to the Bread Lab and see you guys again and go out to some of the farms out in the Skagit Valley and see what you're doing and do some more with that.
Yeah, it's stunning, and we'd love to have you out here.
Matt, any final thoughts?
One of the things you'll be able to see the next time you come out here, Mark, is you'll be able to see some of the test plots growing on the Westland farm, which is something that we have kind of secretly been working on over here over the past year.
Tell me more, because this is the first time I'm hearing about the Westland farm.
Yeah, we closed on a piece of land actually right like as COVID was really hitting back in March, and that's so it kind of didn't seem right to really talk about it then, and we've just kind of been working on it since then. We purchased 80 acres up in the Skagit Valley, of which 20 acres is prime farmland, and we're putting rack houses on this part that's kind of up a hill and in a rocky area, which is not great for farming. But we're going to try to grow maybe up to 60 acres of that whole thing be dedicated to barley agriculture. And part of what we're doing is we are growing. We're working with the Bread Lab, and they're going to be doing some of their test plots actually on our farm out there, which would be really cool. But then we're also going to be growing barley on our farm this upcoming year, which is quite an extraordinary thing. And that will be done under completely organic conditions. And we also actually just literally 3 hours ago just got confirmation that our farm has been certified salmon safe, which is a big, salmon is a keystone species out here in the Pacific Northwest. So it's a big kind of additional sustainable metric, I guess you'd say, for farming and water runoff and stuff like that. So that's the big next step for us, and then this kind of, I guess, leads to the wrap up, right? Which is, this is what Westland is about. We keep pushing. We're constantly looking to get closer to things. There's extraordinary possibilities in whiskey for everybody watching. Not just with Westland, but other places around the world too. There's just so much more that is out there if we just keep looking for it. Whiskey's not done. There's so much more that we can keep pushing in it, and I hope everybody comes along on the ride with us. And if anybody wants to learn more from Westland, we're a total open book on transparency. Ask us anything you want. So I just say thanks very much to everybody who's been watching.
And we're getting a lot of comments on really enjoying all the educational content. So I want to thank our guests, Dr. Stephen Jones of the Washington State University Bread Lab. And give us the website address again for the Bread Lab so folks can find it. There it is right there on the graphic, thebreadlab.wsu.edu.
I'm not a detail guy. Yeah.
That was a pop quiz. And of course, our pal Matt Hofmann from Westland Distillery. Matt, I'm really sorry I won't see you in Victoria in January. I know we always get together then and share a dram, but it looks like neither one of us are going to get to go to Victoria this year.
Yeah, I think this is just the way that it's going to keep going for a little bit. But hey, when this whole thing is over, we're going to have a great time, and we'll have everybody out at the farm and celebrate in style, I think.
And just heads up, heading up next week on the Happy Hour webcast, we will have Kevin O'Gorman, the master distiller at Middleton in Ireland, along with Catherine Condon, who was promoted from their little small craft distillery, artisanal chest distillery at Middleton, to become a distiller at the big distillery up at Middleton, and Dave McCabe, who is Billy Layton's apprentice and will eventually, hopefully, become the master blender at Middleton one of these days when Billy decides to retire. They'll be joining us next week at 5 o'clock Friday night on the Happy Hour webcast. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to join us this weekend for the WhiskyCast podcast, and we will see you soon. Take care of yourselves, everyone. By the way, the vote counts haven't changed a bit while we've been on the air, so if you've been watching election returns, you haven't missed a damn thing. Nothing's happened for the last hour and a half or so. So we'll leave it at that. Good night, everyone, and take care. Have a good weekend. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you soon.